Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So last week I talked about some of the best traits and worst traits of DMs. Today I want to talk about getting your players engaged in your campaign, because this is really the most important thing a Dungeon Master needs to do. You can get away with a bad session, you can get away with a bad encounter. These things aren't great, but it doesn't change the fact that if the players are engaged in your campaign, they're still going to enjoy it, they're still going to have fun. So getting your players engaged is the most important thing you can do. So today what I want to go over is the things I've learned that get players engaged and keep them engaged. But before we do that, I have a Patreon. If you are interested, there is a link in the video description. Otherwise, I just want to thank some of my Archmage level patrons today. I want to thank Thomas Barrero, Geek Dice, Jay Gemmel, Joseph Robideau, and Michael Troy. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and thank you to all my patrons. So let's get started. So if we're talking about engagement, what do I mean by engagement? What I mean is a player who is engaged in a campaign looks forward to that campaign. They are interested to see how that campaign plays out. They're usually really excited about their own character. And this tends to be something that goes with ongoing campaigns. If you're doing a one-shot, you don't really have engagement. People either had fun or they didn't have fun. But if you are playing in a campaign or even an adventure that has several sessions, players that are engaged, it is something that you can sense as a DM, and it is something you need to encourage, because if it doesn't happen, your campaign just probably wasn't a very good one. So how do you recognize engagement? Well, definitely you're going to find that your players are going to give you positive reinforcement after your session. They're going to tell you that they really enjoyed the session. They're going to be talking about looking forward to the next session. You're going to hear them talking to each other in between sessions about the campaign. This is always a huge indicator that they are enjoying your campaign and they're thinking about it when they're not playing. If that happens, they're definitely engaged. And you're going to sense it in the campaign as well. Players are interested in checking things out. They're interested in role-playing with each other. Their characters are becoming more fleshed out and more interesting because they're engaged in their character as well. And as a DM, it's our job to help create and maintain that engagement. So today what I want to go over are 8 ways I've found in order to build engagement in your campaign. And the first, and one of the most important, is you as a DM need to take interest in the player characters. As a DM, you spend the majority of your time developing the campaign. You're trying to make the NPCs interesting. You're trying to make for a memorable villain. You're trying to make the encounters interesting. But it's important to remember what you like about those player characters, because whatever you like about those player characters, the players like those same things. That's why they're accentuating those features. And it helps you guide your process on those other things you're working on, so that the PCs have their shining moments. I talked about shining moments in the first video I did, and by taking an interest in the player characters, really knowing who they are and what kind of features the players are bringing out in the sessions is going to make that really easy. In fact, it almost makes it organic. You almost don't need to plan beyond that. Once you are thinking about who the PCs are and what you like about them, then when you are making your encounters, when you're making your villain, it seems to work into it without much effort at all. The second one, I love the hard decision. And anyone who's played in a campaign that I've run will tell you that I love the hard decision. One of the things that I find really get players engaged in your campaign is their interest in their own characters. Nobody has a fully fleshed out player character just by writing a backstory and filling in some ideals, flaws, and bonds on the character sheet. I love to put the player characters in positions where they have to make a decision and the right answer isn't obvious. Every campaign I run throws in these situations because it gives a player a reason to decide who their character is. If you find out somebody you thought was an enemy has some empathetic traits, do you still destroy them? Someone you have a past with is hunting someone, but you discover that hunted person is actually a good person and becomes a friend to you. Do you betray them? You are tasked with clearing some were-rat squatters from the area of a city. Do you investigate why they're there? or do you attempt to exterminate them? These are questions players in my current campaigns are going to recognize. And the purpose of these encounters is to get the players to think about who their characters are and who they want them to be. The more a player takes these journeys of discovery about their own character, the more interesting that character is likely to become. If the answers are easy, that's an indication to me that I need to make the decisions harder so that the players can have these moments of doubt about what the results they even want to happen. If you want to encourage the players to have great role-playing moments that develop their relationships with each other, this is a great way to do that. Because what one player thinks is the right answer and what another player thinks may not be the same thing. And then they have to talk about it, and they have to debate it, and who their characters are is going to come out. And once those characters develop in that way, and they become more rich, and they become more nuanced, that's when players really become engaged in their own characters. And if they're engaged in their own characters, there's a good chance they're going to become engaged in your campaign. And these hard decisions create some of the greatest role-playing moments in the entire campaign. And the third one is learn from your mistakes. I just brought up an example where the player characters were tasked with clearing out some were-rat squatters, and it was intended to be a difficult decision. But it didn't end up working out the way I intended. Instead, it was a very easy decision for the players to wipe out these were-rats without any investigation. And although I tried as things unfolded to give the players hints that these were-rats weren't evil and just wanted to communicate with the PCs, those hints were missed or ignored, and once it was clear that the player characters couldn't kill all the were-rats, they decided to kill as many as they could before escaping. Again, there was no debate between the players on this, so my hard decision turned out not to be a hard one at all for the players. After the session, I took some time to think about how this went wrong, and it occurs to me that in this group that are used to fighting for their lives, in order to create that doubt, I needed to deliver it more clearly before the mission began. I should have had the players interact with people who didn't want the were-rats killed, or who thought the were-rats would make better allies than enemies, who think the mission was misguided. As a DM, we all make these mistakes, but the advantage of these mistakes is that if we choose to, we can learn from them, so next time we handle things differently. As I said at the beginning, not every encounter needs to be great, but if we learn from our mistakes, we can make sure that the next encounter is. The fourth one is theme, and I mentioned this in my last video, but I want to develop it a bit further. If a campaign is geared towards a theme, this builds excitement in your campaign. If the campaign is about being trapped somewhere hostile and attempting to escape, you want to reinforce the idea of being hunted, about danger, about panic. Players who can feel the theme of a campaign in every session will become interested in what happens next. Are we ever going to escape? Are we being pursued? How close are those pursuers? What will happen if we're caught? To what lengths will we go to prevent that from happening? And by the way, that's an excellent way to get back to some difficult character developing decisions. When the theme goes from one session to the next, players get involved in that theme. And again, when they sit down to play with you, they automatically end up in that mood for that theme. And it becomes easier and easier to get that theme across. And then once the session is over, the players will get up from that session having had an emotional reaction to the theme, whether it was panic or fear or wonder, whatever it is. When we sit down to a session, an emotional response is what we want to have. Again, this is the same as if we sit down to watch a movie. If we get up from the movie and we were entertained during the movie and we walk out of the theater and we've forgotten the plot by the time we get to our car, that might have been an okay movie, but it wasn't a great movie. A great movie has that emotional response that has that continued effect after the movie is over, gets you thinking. Same is true of a great role-playing session. And my fifth point kind of ties in with the fourth point, and that's reinforcing the theme with good maps, ambient music, imagery, description, and situations. These all get the players in the mood for the theme of the campaign. If the campaign is supposed to emphasize wonder, describe locations that are packed with wonder. Use ambient music or sounds in the background that enhance that wonder. Provide artwork, if you can find some, that helps to flesh out your description. And remember that not all encounters need to involve combat or even challenges. For example, if we are in a creepy campaign and you have the characters arriving at a graveyard, you want to describe that graveyard in a way that brings across the theme of it being creepy. It's dark. The moon is peeking out between dark clouds. A crow caws from atop a crypt. Soft but spooky music plays in the background as you describe the player characters navigating this ancient place, breaking webbing with their hands to reach the door to the crypt, only to see their own names engraved along with the names of the dead inside. The players are going to be on the edge of their seats, even with no combats or challenges. Don't be afraid to use movies or other media and steal away. This isn't published work. You're after a feeling, not necessarily always originality. Number 6, recognize the signs of engagement and/or the lack of engagement. Players who are engaged will occasionally communicate with you about the game between sessions, or you will witness them communicating with each other about the game. Players who are engaged in their characters will be floating ideas off you about how their character is developing. Players who are engaged in the mood you're creating will react physically and/or verbally as you're creating that mood. Players who are disinterested or bored will give you cues to that as well. In some cases, this can be reversed if you find out what's not connecting. I've been in campaigns that I might have enjoyed, except my player character wasn't developing in the way I had hoped, or the moments I was hoping for to develop the character with role play just weren't occurring, and the option to create those situations wasn't there. And if you can recognize this as a DM, then you can correct it. And this leads to my next point, which is number 7. If something isn't working, fix it or abandon it. If the players seem more distracted by the ambient music than finding it enhancing to their experience, don't push it down their throats. You could try a change, maybe lowering the volume is the answer. But if it's not working, just stop using it. If a player character is not developing the way the player wants, and they're no longer excited by their own character, you can attempt to change that, or, you know what, let them retire the character. If that's what they want, let them do it without penalty. I see way too many DMs very stringent about this. Sorry, that's your character, and you're not allowed to retire him because it's part of our story. And I can understand that, because it can be disappointing when a player wants to change a character, especially when you had a specific plot point that revolved around that character, and now you need to abandon it. I get it. That is tough. But you know what? You let them change their character, and often that new character is more engaging for them. And you know what? Their new character is going to give you new options to create those plot points. And that brings me to my final point, which I think is potentially the most important. And that is build trust. It's one thing to say that you are a DM that's going to carry your campaign to completion. It's another to prove it over and over. So a player joining a campaign knows it's worth being excited for that campaign because you will carry it all the way through. It's one thing to say you're going to be prepared for sessions. It's another to show that week after week so that the player knows that in tonight's session there's going to be something new and thought out. It's one thing to say that you're going to be reliable, but it's another to be there on time, week after week, so that the players can trust that. It's one thing to say that you will respond positively to feedback. It's another to actually do it when it comes up. Trust with your players is not built by telling them you have these traits and that you know what the right things to do are. It is built by following through. Actions always speak louder than words. When a DM ends a campaign, at the end of that campaign, and has demonstrated these traits, I'm even more excited for their next campaign because I have trust. Because I've determined that this is the kind of DM this person is. And I think this is potentially the most important because this, and only this, can get you engagement from your players on day 1. And engagement is way easier to maintain than to create. Now, I'm sure there are other ways to create and maintain engagement. These just happen to be the tools I use. So when I am running a campaign, I take effort. I take effort to know who the player characters are and take interest in them. When they roleplay in a session, I'm going to be listening to what they do, thinking about the decisions they make so that it informs my planning afterwards. If there isn't a hard decision already written in your campaign, think about how you're going to put one in. You want to have the characters make decisions that aren't easy. These kind of decisions always make a player think about who their character is. And it might even give a chance for a character to develop, because the most interesting characters change throughout a story. I never hold a player to the ideals, bonds, and traits that they filled in on their character sheet when they made their character. If you do this, you are forcing a character to be two-dimensional. The best characters in all kinds of stories are the characters that develop, and that means that the character that they made when they wrote their character in the first place and the character that they have several sessions in could be, and maybe even should be, different. That ideal that they once held has changed because the events of the campaign have changed who that person is. That's a good thing. Learn from your mistakes. Learn from your successes too. I just happen to find that I tend to learn more from my mistakes than my successes. When something doesn't work, take some time. Sit down. Think about what happened in the session. Why didn't it work? What could I have done differently to make it work? Because some situations that will work with some groups of players in some campaigns won't work in other campaigns with other players. Because people are different, because campaigns are different, because your theme is different, because the dynamics of the party are different. And when something doesn't work, it tells you something about that dynamic. And you can learn from that so that you understand that dynamic better the next time you're planning a session. And the theme, again, is something you should think of while you're planning the campaign, well before you start it. It's maybe even the first thing you should think about before you develop anything else in your campaign. What do you want this campaign to feel like? Because when you get that idea concrete in your head, every other step of planning a campaign is going to revolve around that. And when I'm planning a session, then I know what that theme is, so I know what kind of maps I want. I know what kind of artwork I want. I know what kind of music I want. And I know what kind of language I want to use to describe the situations the characters are in. And when I hear about the campaign between sessions, and when I witness the players communicating with each other, I take note of that as well. It tells me who is really engaged in the campaign. When players come to me about their characters, I know this is always a good thing. Even critical feedback can be a sign of engagement, because if the player takes that time to tell you about those things that are bothering them, that means they care enough about your campaign to want to fix those things that are wrong with it. If they were just completely unengaged, they would quit. If they're giving you that feedback, it means there's something they want to continue. And if something isn't working, the players are going to make that clear to you as well. And that often comes through feedback. Often it comes right as you use those things in the session. And sometimes I come up with an idea that's really cool, and I put it out there, and it just doesn't get the response I'm looking for. Well, I'm going to look at that. Is there something I could change to make it work better? But if not, I need to let it go. Maybe I could try it in a different campaign, but this apparently isn't the group or the campaign to have that idea work. And there's just no point in beating a dead horse. And finally, building trust. I just can't state enough how much that has done for me as a DM. When you play with the same players for multiple campaigns, they know what to expect from you. Once somebody gives you feedback and you respond to it, the next time they're considering giving you feedback, it's so much easier for them. It's difficult for a player to tell a DM that there's something they're not enjoying or that something's not working for them. That can be intimidating. How is the DM going to react? Once they do so and they see how you react, they'll know how it's going to go next time. And when you complete that campaign, the player knows that if they join another campaign that you are running, that's probably what they can expect. When a player arrives to a session on time, and they know that you're going to be on time too, they know that if for some reason something unavoidable is going to make you late, you're going to let everybody know. They know that if you miss a session, it's got to be an emergency. And canceling sessions for anything that's not an emergency is done well in advance. And those are the best ways that I know of to get players interested in your campaigns and keep them so. Now, if you guys have some other ideas, and I'm sure you have tons, and I'm sure you have lots of examples that you've found. I'd love to hear them in the video description down below, because I don't have all the answers, and I would love to know more about how other DMs are keeping their players engaged. And next week I'm going to complete this series by going over how I build encounters for campaigns. I hope you'll join me for that. Until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.